Hey, wild dogs. Hope your summer's going well. Let's continue with the Maze of Bones. We are on chapter 12 on page 126. I have my puppy down below me, so I'll pet him once in a while. Otherwise, it should be smooth reading. Let's get started. All right, chapter 12. Dan was tempted to stop about 20 times as they trailed Irina Spassky down the Rue de Rivoli. He wondered if that meant the street of ravioli, but he decided Amy would laugh at him if he asked. A few times he wanted to check stuff out, like the cool glass pyramid at the Louvre, and the street performers who were juggling fire outside the Tuileries garden. There was also a vendor selling creme glacée, and Dan was pretty sure that meant ice cream. Mostly, though, he wanted to stop because his feet hurt. Is she ever going to take a break, he complained. Amy didn't seem to be getting tired at all. Does it seem odd to you that we happened to find Irina Spassky out of 10 million people in Paris? Maybe the other 9.99 million aren't wearing bright red scarves. She was walking down a major street like she wanted to be spotted. You think it's a trap? Dan asked. How could she know we'd find her? She hasn't looked back once. She doesn't know we're here. But as he said that, Dan remembered television shows he'd seen about spies, how they could tail somebody without ever being seen, or appear accidentally in a victim's line of sight and lure them into a trap. Could Irina have been waiting for them at the airport? Could she have seen them getting in the limo with Jonah and somehow gotten ahead of them? Look, Amy said, she's turning. Irina crossed the avenue and disappeared down a flight of steps. The metro, Amy said. She's taking the subway. They lost time figuring out how to use euro coins in the machines to get tickets, but when they got down the steps, Irina was still there, standing on one of the platforms with the tattered almanac tucked under her arm. The train was just arriving. Dan was sure Irina was going to try one of those last-minute switches, so they waited until the train's doors were closing, but Irina stayed on board. Amy and Dan jumped on too, and the train pulled away from the station. They changed trains twice in a really short time. Even with Irina in a bright red shawl, it was hard to keep up with her. I don't get it, Amy said. Now she's moving faster, like she's trying to lose us. Dan was daydreaming about creme glacée. The lasagna he'd had on the plane was long gone, and his stomach felt like it was trying to chew through his shirt. Finally, after the third train, Irina exited onto the platform. Amy gripped Dan's arm and pointed to a sign on the station wall. Passy, she said. So? This is the neighborhood where Benjamin Franklin lived. Well, come on, Dan said. Red Riding Hood's getting away. Passy didn't seem as crowded as Tuileries. The streets were lined with four-story buildings. There were flower shops everywhere, like a Mother's Day explosion, tulips, carnations, roses, everything that could possibly make Dan sneeze. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower rose against the gray clouds, but Dan was more interested in the smell of food. The whole city seemed to be made up of outdoor cafes. He could smell chocolate, fresh-baked bread, melting cheese, but Dan didn't have time to get any of it. Irina walked like her dress was on fire. They had to jog to keep up. Amy tripped over a bucket of flowers, and a Parisian cussed at her. Sorry, Amy called back. They turned onto a tree-lined street with ancient-looking mansions. Halfway up the block, a purple van was parked crookedly. It was painted with pictures of balloons and clown faces, and the sign read, Creme Glacée. Dan's spirits lifted. Maybe he could just grab a quick triple scoop of cherry vanilla to go. But as they got closer, he saw that the van was shut. The windshield was covered from the inside with a silver screen. It was a conspiracy, Dan decided. The entire city of Paris was trying to starve him. At the end of the block, Irina crossed the street and ducked inside a wrought iron gate. She walked up to a large marble building that looked like an embassy or something. Dan hid behind a gatepost and watched as Irina punched a security code and went inside. Look at the gate, Amy said. In the center was a gold-lettered sign that read, Institut de Diplomatie Internationale. And then in English, Institute for International Diplomacy. The Lucian Crest, Dan said. But what's an institute for, whatever that means? I guess it's like a school for ambassadors, Amy said. But don't you get it? That's just a cover. You remember what Jonah said? Paris is a Lucian stronghold. Dan's eyes lit up. This must be their secret base. Amy nodded. The question is, what do we do? We go in, Dan said. Right. Without the security code? 5910. I watched her punch it in. Amy stared at him. How did you? Never mind. Let's go. Be careful. They probably have cameras and guard dogs and stuff. They squeezed inside the gate and ran up the front steps. Dan punched in the code. The door opened easily. No alarms went off. No dogs barked. Weird, he muttered, but it was too late for second guessing. They slipped inside the Lucian base. The entry hall was bigger than their whole apartment. The floor was polished marble and a chandelier hung from the ceiling. A set of black doors stood in front of them. On the left, a spiral staircase led up to a balcony. Look, Dan pointed above the doors. A surveillance camera was sweeping the room. It was angled away from them, but it wouldn't be for long. Then he heard voices from behind the double doors, someone coming in their direction. Quick! He ran for the stairs. Amy looked like she wanted to argue, but there was no time. She followed him. Dan's heart pounded. He'd always thought it would be cool to play burglar and sneak into someone's house, but now that he was doing it for real, his hands were sweating. He wondered if the French still threw burglars into rat-infested dungeons. He'd seen something like that once in a musical Grace told them about. They sneaked along a second-floor hallway. I don't get it, Dan whispered. Irina must be a Lucian. Benjamin Franklin was a Lucian. Does that mean Franklin was one of the bad guys? Maybe it's not that simple, Amy said. Look. Painted portraits hung along the walls. Napoleon Bonaparte, Isaac Newton, Winston Churchill, a few others Dan didn't recognize. More famous Lucians, Amy guessed. Not necessarily good or bad, but definitely a lot of powerful people. And we just invaded their house, Dan said. They passed a row of heavy oak doors, all of them closed. One was labeled Logistique. Another read Cartography. The last door on the right read Arsenal. Sweet! Dan, no, Amy whispered, but she was too late to intercept him. Dan opened the arsenal door and slipped inside. A little late, he considered that it might not be a good idea to enter a room full of weapons if there was already someone in there. Fortunately, there wasn't. The arsenal was about 30 feet square and full of amazingly cool stuff. Crates of cannonballs, racks of knives, swords, canes, shields, and umbrellas. Dan wasn't sure about the umbrellas, but he figured they did something besides just stop the rain. We shouldn't be here, Amy hissed. Gee, you think? Dan picked up a shoebox-sized wooden crate full of glass tubes with copper wires twined around the tops. Hey, it's one of those Franklin batteries, like in the museum. Amy's eyebrows furrowed. What's it doing in an arsenal? Don't know, but I'm collecting it. Despite Amy's protests, Dan stuffed the battery in his backpack. It fit because the pack was pretty much empty. The only other thing he had in there was the picture of his parents wrapped in its plastic sleeve, which he decided to keep with him for good luck. A styrofoam egg carton caught his eye. He opened it and found a single silver orb with little blinking red lights. This is cool too. He dropped it into his backpack. Dan, no! What? They've got plenty of other stuff, and we need all the help we can get. Could be dangerous. I hope so. He was admiring the shurikens and thinking he might take some of those too when a door slammed somewhere down the hall. Better know what she's doing, a man said in English. If she's wrong... A woman responded in French. Both voices faded down the corridor. Come on, Amy insisted. Now. They poked their heads out to make sure the hall was clear, then sneaked out of the arsenal and deeper into the building. The end of the hall was another balcony, this one looking down on a big circular room. What Dan saw below reminded him of a military command center. There were computers along the walls, and in the middle of the room was a conference table that seemed to be one huge flat screen TV. Irina Spassky was alone, leaning over the tabletop. Stacks of papers and folders sat next to her. She was punching commands on the tabletop, making images zoom or shrink. She was looking at a satellite map of the city. Dan didn't dare speak, but he locked eyes with Amy. "I want one of those," he told her. Amy's expression said, "Shut up!" They crouched behind the balcony rail and watched as Irina commanded the map to zoom in on different locations. She checked the Poor Richard's Almanac book, then got out a pad of paper and jotted something down. She snatched up the book and the pad and hurried out of the room, back toward the main entrance. "Amy, come on!" Dan straddled the railing. "You'll break your legs. Hang from the edge and just drop. I've done it off the roof at school 1,000,000 times. It's easy." He did, and it was. A second later, they were both at the conference table, staring at the image, still flickering on the screen. A white targeting icon hovering over one particular spot in Paris. The address glowed in red letters, 23 Rue des Jardins. Dan pointed to a ribbon of blue surrounding the dot. "That's water, which means that little blob she was targeting must be an island." "The Isle St. Louis," Amy said. "It's on the Seine River, right in the middle of Paris. Can you memorize that address?" "Already done." Then Dan noticed something else, a photograph sitting on top of Irina Spassky's files. He picked it up and felt sick to his stomach. "It's him." Dan showed Amy the photo, an older man with gray hair and a black suit, crossing the street. The photo was fuzzy, but it must have been taken in Paris. Dan could tell from the Yellowstone buildings and the French signs. "The man in black is here." Amy paled. "But why?" A voice came from somewhere down the hall. "J'entends des mouvements. Folies de bâtiment." I took French in high school. I'm not good at it anymore, so I'm trying to get all these French words. We'll see if they come out right. Dan didn't need to speak French to know that meant trouble. He and Amy ran the other direction, down another hallway. "Arrêtez!" a man yelled behind them. Immediately, alarms started blaring. "Oh, great," Amy said. "This way!" Dan turned a corner. He didn't dare look behind them. He could hear their pursuers getting closer, boots pounding on the marble floor. "Bars," Amy warned. The building's automatic defenses must have been activated. Right in front of them, a set of metal bars was descending from the ceiling, cutting off the hallway. "Slide into third," Dan yelled. "What?" Amy demanded, glancing back at the security guards. Dan ran forward and hit the ground like it was a water slide, slipping under the bars. "Come on!" Amy hesitated. The bars were getting lower, 3 feet off the ground, 2.5 feet. Behind her, 2 burly guys in black security guard outfits were closing fast, armed with nightsticks. "Amy, now!" She dropped and started crawling under the bars. Dan pulled her through just as the bars clanged against the floor. The security guards grabbed at them through the bars, but Dan and Amy were already running. They found an open door and ducked into a parlor. "The window," Dan said. A metal mesh curtain was closing over the glass. It was already halfway down. There was no time to think. Dan picked up a bust of Napoleon from the coffee table and threw it through the glass. Crash! You could hear the guards in the hallway shouting over the wail of alarms. Dan kicked the remaining glass shards away. "Go," he told Amy. She crawled through and he followed, pulling his left foot out just before the metal curtain clamped against the windowsill. They ran through the garden, climbed the iron gates, and raced across the street. They ducked behind the purple ice cream van and slid to the ground, breathing hard. Dan looked back, but there were no signs of pursuit, at least not yet. "Let's not do that again," Amy said. Dan's blood was racing. Now that he was out of danger, he realized how much fun he'd just had. "I want an arsenal, and one of those computer screen tables, Amy. We need to make our own secret headquarters." "Oh, sure," Amy said, still breathing hard. She pulled some change and bills out of her pocket. "I've got about 253 euros left. You think that'll buy a secret headquarters?" Dan's heart sank. She didn't have to be so mean about it, but she was right. They were burning through their money fast. He didn't have much more than she did. They'd given most of it to Nellie for travel expenses, but it still wasn't much. If they had to fly somewhere else after Paris, he decided not to think about it. One thing at a time. "Let's get back to the metro," he said. "Yes," Amy said, "back to Nellie. She'll be getting worried." Dan shook his head. "No time, sis. 23 Rue des Jardins. We have to find out what's on that island, and we have to get there before Irina." And that leaves us at chapter 13. All right, Have a good day, y'all. Bye bye.